Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Doyle. I'm a professor of economics at the MIT Sloan School. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this session that we're really excited about. It's going to build off of what you heard this morning and what you heard just now. I am the faculty director of our Health Systems Initiative at MIT Sloan, and I sit on the board of the MIT's Jameel Poverty Action Lab. And wearing both of those hats, I run clinical trials with large payers, providers, employers to see what we can do to improve health and through healthcare delivery redesigns. Oftentimes, I'm interested in trying to address poverty issues to try to improve health. So, it's an inspiring area and one that we can think about bringing innovations from science here at MIT to the field. The title of today's session is Delivering on the Promise. So it's all about translation. We've heard about these amazing innovations that the postdocs and undergrads and PhD students and faculty are doing here. How do we get those translated into policy and practice? As an economist, my perspective is that we need to have incentives for innovation. We need to have a return on investment that will be there. But just as important, we need to have a sustainable and accessible version of these type of innovations in order to make a real impact on human health. So I was really inspired by the discussion we've heard today, whether it was from Nubar or the previous panel about what we can do from a policy standpoint to try to make those type of impacts. And that's the beauty of HEALS, is it's a cross-institute collaboration from bioengineers all the way to economists like me. So it's really my pleasure to introduce the people who will be speaking in today's session. You'll hear from Barry Stein. Barry is the Chief Clinical Innovation Officer and Chief Medical Informatics Officer at Hartford Healthcare. And he's known as an industry leader in thinking about how to bring these type of innovations, especially using data analytics, machine learning, and optimization to improve patient care and system performance. In fact, he works with our second speaker today, who is Dimitri Bertsimis. Dimitri is MIT's Vice Provost for Open Learning and Associate Dean for AI and Online Education at Sloan. He's really a world leader in developing new tools to optimize various types of systems, including healthcare systems, using machine learning and analytics techniques. Then we'll hear from Amy Thomas-Moran, who is the Andrew Mellon Associate Professor of Anthropology here at MIT. So she'll bring a design lens to think about how to improve healthcare delivery with an eye toward aligning innovation with patient and provider realities. And then our fourth speaker is Simon Johnson, the Ronald Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship, former IMF chief economist, and in 2024 was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for his groundbreaking work on how institutions in society shape prosperity. And today we'll hear his thoughts on how a particular institution, public health, shapes our human health. So we'll start with some remarks from these speakers, and then we'll have a brief time for some Q&A at the end. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker to kick us off from Hartford Healthcare, Barry Stein.
Thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, everybody. Looking forward to giving you a little bit of an overview of how we at Hartford Healthcare, together with many, many folks at MIT, implement AI to really impact patient care. So why is there so much optimism? Everybody's pretty excited. And if we have a look at the AI revolution over the last year or two or three, we started with perceptive AI, facial recognition, speech recognition. Then we went on to prescriptive and predictive analytics. Generative AI almost feels like yesteryear, and that's really helped our patients as well as clinicians significantly. It's really democratized our knowledge. We're now into agentic AI, AI taking actions on our behalf, and we're starting to get into robotic or physical AI. So this is sort of a mental model of what it may look like in the clinical arena. We've got two folks, theoretically similar IQs, EQs on multiple dimensions, and one of them starts using AI. You could argue that that person becomes more intelligent if the AI is correct. And if it's not correct, you certainly can be operating at a disadvantage. So now let's just take that into the clinical environment. We've got multiple people around a patient operating with different AI pretty quickly. You're not sure if it's correct, if it's not correct. Now what we do is we overlay agentic AI, where we've got multiple agents, you can't even see them, interacting with one another and taking actions on our behalf. And then you introduce a robot. This is a completely different environment with massive opportunity to change healthcare, but also quite significant risk. So what are some of the concerns? Most of you are very, very familiar with them, but I would argue that patient harm is fundamental to almost everything else, and physical harm, emotional harm. But we really have to understand all these concerns and mitigate them if we want to accelerate AI into the clinical environment and really enjoy the opportunity. So at Hartford Healthcare, as I mentioned, and Joe had mentioned, I work with Dimitri Bitsimis, and I've been doing that for 10 years since I was at MIT, and 20 plus of his PhD students. And over 10 years, we've developed a capability to rapidly accelerate bench to bedside safely, wanting to innovate safely. And we've developed our Center for AI Innovation to do so, and it has 6 fundamental pillars. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them, but thematically, if you can have a look here, they've all come up this morning and early afternoon, the ecosystem being the most important. You cannot do this alone. And we've developed a huge ecosystem with academics, corporate, startups, venture capital, government, as well as at MIT. So how do we start? I mean, there's massive opportunity. How do you prioritize? Well, the first thing I always talk about is we fall in love with the problem, not the technology. AI is changing every day and becoming obsessed with the problem, the clinical problem to solve. And at Hartford Healthcare, we use A squared, E squared. I needed to put an equation in for MIT. But A squared, E squared stands for the following, and it's not just for Hartford Healthcare. If you think about it, it's universal. It's how do we improve access? How do we improve affordability? How do we improve health equity and excellence, quality and safety? And one could argue we've been iterative all along the way, making small sort of improvements. We now have the opportunity to sort of have an exponential improvement in all 4. So let me give you just 1 or 2 examples around access. We use agentic AI for patients 24/7, get onto the mobile app, they interact with the chatbot, have a conversation about your clinical problem, and then a warm handoff to a clinician with everything summarized. We use radiology detection algorithms to help radiologists read thousands of images more accurately. And we're using ambient AI such that the clinician doesn't have to be typing away at the computer, but can have FaceTime with the patient. These are just 3 examples of many, including a good few that we worked on with Dimitri Bitsimis. How do we detect subdural or bleeding in the brain? How do we make a more accurate diagnosis about a UTI? How do you take an EKG that ordinarily is just for rhythms and to determine if you've got sort of, you're having a heart attack, and basically say, I want to work out how's the heart functioning? What's the actual pump function of the heart, which is usually evaluated with a very expensive echo. That's real health equity and excellence. So at Hartford Healthcare and many other places around the world, we approach AI just like we do a new device or a new drug. When you go to a clinician and they prescribe a medication, you're expecting them to know all these things. Think about the last time somebody wrote you a prescription. You just assume they know what it's for, how to recognize a complication, how to treat a complication, how it functions, all of that kind of stuff. Implicitly, you expect that from your clinician. And the same with AI. With one caveat. A drug and a device doesn't change. Can you imagine going to that same clinician, they give you penicillin, and they say, yeah, I know all that stuff, but I have no idea what it's going to do tomorrow. Probably no one would take it with comfort. So we've developed, and a lot of folks now, and this is where a lot of the research and development is occurring, is how do you monitor this stuff once it's out there? AI, you could consider like a humanoid. We don't just bring new grads in and say, go to take care of the most complex ICU patient. It takes years for us to determine if they've got judgment, contextual application of knowledge. So it's about clinical accountability, transparency, and continuous monitoring to maintain the trust. In addition to that, we've developed a governance process, a multidimensional governance process, clinical, operational, technical, legal, ethics, looking at it all different viewpoints before we deploy into clinical practice. And it's distributed risk ownership. And then we think about education. We can't expect these powerful tools to be used unless we've educated our clinicians, our patients. And if we think about it, we've done a lot of work with Dimitri at MIT, and I'm sure Dimitri will talk about the OpenAI platform that he's developed together with his colleagues at MIT. But if you think about the mental model I showed you with all this relatively autonomous kind of activity, the one industry and one profession that's pretty aligned to that is the aviation industry, the pilot. When I walk onto an airplane, I always turn left. I love all the dials and all that kind of stuff, but more importantly, I want to see somebody with gray hair. Because things do go wrong, and you want to make sure that person knows what to do when things go wrong. And how do they train? In a simulation environment. And over the last 10 or 50, 20 years at Hartford Healthcare, we've developed this huge simulation environment for robotic surgery, for IV placement, for trauma. The Navy trains there, multiple different clinicians, the police force trains there. We feel that this kind of autonomous environment will be well served in a simulation environment to educate the future of our clinical environment. And then just lastly, data. You can do nothing in this domain without data. And data has a lot of meaning to it for our patients, the privacy, worried about it getting out and certain things happening to them. So over the last 10 years, we've developed a multimodal data layer to allow us to incorporate all these different kinds of data to improve our models safely. So if we think about maintaining trust, because ultimately, in healthcare, trust is everything. It takes years to build up and minutes to break down. And we've got to think about this new environment that we spoke about. Completely different for the clinician as well as the patient and everybody else that's working around. And as we think about these technologies that are coming along, the perceptive, the generative, the agentic, the physical, we have to continually pressure test each one of them against trust. Is this going to improve trust? Is this going to transform healthcare? Or is it going to rupture trust? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Barry, I will write a check after the presentation. Thank you. So I will talk about a topic very dear to me, holistic AI for medicine, HAIM for short, is the Hebrew word for life, and its applications. So multimodal AI, briefly mentioned by Barry in the last seconds, I would like to start with the observation that we as humans perceive the world, what we do today, in a multimodal way. Sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And these coordinate to understand and evaluate things. So multimodality is a fundamental characteristic of human life. So it is reasonable to expect that given the evolution of AI and its success in the last few years, it is reasonable to expect that developing models that combine computer vision, language, tabular data, and genomics occasionally can do better in medicine than any one of the modes alone. And that's the purpose of this effort. I would like to say that I have worked with over many years at MIT, I've worked with multiple systems. In the last decade, I have worked with Harvard system. And I found from experience that it combines the following few characteristics. First of all, willing leadership, not always present. Second, data in appropriate form and ready to be used. Willing physicians. And finally, education. Barry mentioned that if you look at the medical profession, their knowledge of the doctors, the physicians, the residents in AI is extremely limited, I'm afraid. It's not, the medical system educates physicians, using the model of Hopkins University from 1920s, so the last century. It has not been enhanced with the significant evolution that has happened in AI in the world. But in my other role as Vice Provost for Open Learning, we have started the effort of trying to educate the world in AI, and in particular, healthcare professionals. So we launched what's called Universal AI, and we have at the moment, including Harvard Healthcare, a few other hospital systems that we try to educate. In fact, I was hoping to collaborate with my friends at Hills to develop deeper understanding of the topic. So HIME has the following idea. This is its methodology. So how do you combine modes? So these are the various data that the medical establishment has: tabular data, EMR, time series, images, and notes. So if you look at what needs to happen, we need to put them in a unified language. Our first effort was to put it in the unified language of numbers. We take images, shown on the left, and we're using deep learning methods. We actually summarize the image with what is called an embedding, which is a vector of numbers that summarize the image. Similarly, with language, we use pre-trained very large language models. BERT is one of them. BERT does not stand for BERTSIMAS. It has a collection of summarizations that you use, and you put it there. This is the second. Tabular data is already numbers, time series, and so forth. Genomics can also be done. So you take all of this sequence, you put them as a concatenation of numbers. So now you have a unified language, and you use traditional machine learning to predict an outcome. And this has worked quite well. We published a paper in 2022 in Nature Digital Medicine. It has a disadvantage that it was not very explainable. So the second idea, what's called XHIME, explainable HIME, is in addition, so now we don't use the unifying language of numbers, we use the unifying aspects of words. So we, instead of summarizing numbers, we summarize, we use language. We take, for example, tabular data, and we don't say, we say the BMI of the person is 25. The blood pressure of the person is systolic pressure is 142. So we use it as language. And then we summarize this in this way, and then we use the fantastic progress that has happened in the last year or two on large language models that have been becoming particularly powerful. And in addition, we now have an explanation. So an example of that, you won't have time to read it, but you summarize, you find references, and you explain what is it that you are saying, which is absent from before. It is a better model than before. It improves on a variety of settings. And now in the remaining 5 minutes or so, I would like to give you some examples of where we used it with some success. Some of it, quite a bit of it, at Harvard Hospital System. So one of the significant issues in medicine is understanding, detecting, predicting the prognosis of subdural hematoma, bleeding in the brain. So the assessment problem, somebody comes, do you have hematoma or not? And you don't have a lot of time to detect that. You know, the life of a person is on the, on the line. So based on machine learning, you understand, using the HIME and the XHIME methodology, you understand the probability of hematoma, and this materially affects triage. It might take a long time to build the algorithm, but to run it is milliseconds. Then you localize the hematoma, you outline, independent of its size. You observe the red part. This is where the hematoma was localized. And this gives you explainability for physicians. Not only you say the probability that hematoma exists is 92%, but here's where we believe it is. And finally, we predict this, how likely it is that it would be worsening in the next day, 2 days, 3 days, and so forth, which is particularly relevant for the right treatment. We have found that the combination, each of the methods alone is reasonable, but together, using the Heim method, it improves to quite practical 94, 95%. The prediction, which is actually quite more difficult, is not as strong, but still useful. So in other words, the combination of these things gives you an edge. Another example at Hartford Healthcare of an implemented system, the previous is in pilot, is we utilize data of the type I mentioned to reduce length of stay at Hartford Healthcare for about half a day, for about 5.4 days to about 4.9 days, roughly half a day difference. Why is this relevant? Without increasing the probability of readmission. In other words, you do release from the hospital faster the right patients. And for those of you that are involved in clinical settings, decreasing length of stay has many advantages, one of which, of course, is monetary, because you increase the throughput. For a place like the major Hartford Hospital, which has 860 beds, for every patient that leaves the system, there is one that takes. So instead of, so if you have, let's say, 538, you see 74 patients a day in that bed. 64 patients, for 493, you do 74, it was 10 patients more. And you can multiply by 800 beds, you serve far more patients. This has monetary implications, but also public health implications. Also, by patients not staying in the hospital too long, the hospital is not the safest place to be, so it also has benefits of the health time. There are many other areas, I have only 1.5 minutes. In oncology, early detection and therapeutics. In cardiology, detection, Barry mentioned, we are working with some of the physicians there, quite a few of them, on detecting multiple cardiac diseases from an EKG. So I actually lost my first cousin. He went to a hospital, 48 years old, a fireman, and he was not diagnosed. It was Saturday night, but a system like that would have detected some of the issues. Surgery. Do you do, for example, what's called SAVR versus TAVR, one of the most significant diseases for aortic valve replacement is to do it surgically or transcatheter. So this is a prescriptive question, which type of surgery based on this high methodology I told you. In psychiatry actually is not an area that has received a lot of attention from an AI perspective. So we utilize, with some of our friends at Hartford, X-Heim for diagnosis and therapeutics where explainability matters. My experience, and it's non-zero, with physicians is in addition to being accurate, it has to be understandable, explainable. And I think that was helpful. And another project that I do at MGB is intimate partner violence with a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Kurana, is to detect, I thought that intimate partner violence is a third world country issue. It is not, it is a first world country. There are, at least in my eyes, I have seen 4,000 cases 1 year at the Brigham. So trying to detecting by using radiological reports, notes and so forth is relevant, and this methodology is relevant in this case. So overall, I hope to give you a sense of enthusiasm of combining all of our knowledge in AI, and medicine, in my view, is a particularly attractive and exciting area for that. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation to be part of this conversation today. My name is Amy Moran Thomas. And in social perspectives on health and medicine, we tend to often talk about needed innovation and missing science. We also tend to speak from notes, so thank you for being part of this interdisciplinary experiment already. But research in my field of medical anthropology shows how unintended design gaps play a crucial but often underestimated role in the erosion of public trust in science and medicine today. By understanding such gaps in current medical design and their real-world impacts, we can work together to better respond to them and hopefully open paths toward making those technologies better in the future. Digital health is transforming medical care at so many scales today. And often it feels like this is happening so quickly that there's not enough time to sort of spend serious reflection with these questions around which aspects are the future that we want, and to place specific innovations in health technology, which can be so exciting and meaningful, in larger societal frames, and think about those social systems questions as well. My own approach to these questions draws on ethnographic analysis, talking with people, families, doctors, patients, engineers, building relationships over time, and trying to understand social realities of what's important to people as a way to go beyond the kinds of data like surveys that are often quite useful, but in some ways more limited, to get a deeper sense of relationships and historical contexts. Anthropology also teaches us to pay attention to the material culture of people's interactions with technologies. And this materiality, the actual hardware through which direct inputs are collected, tends to fall in and out of conversations of digital health sometimes. But my focus on instruments first began when I was doing research on the global diabetes epidemic. As many of you likely know, diabetes is one of the leading causes of death in the world, including across Central America and the Caribbean, where I began doing work almost 20 years ago now. And the problem was often framed as patient non-adherence with treatment options. But what I saw when people I met in clinics invited me to visit their homes was a lot of broken down technology. Nearly everyone I met had broken glucose meters that they couldn't use because strips were so expensive. Sometimes they had a whole array. There were so many specialized parts that weren't interchangeable. And young people with type 1 diabetes often couldn't use those meters then to gauge insulin doses, or could only do so at great cost. And continuous blood glucose management in this context was generally not considered an option because you can't get replacement parts. So I saw this trickle-down model of design not working in a lot of spaces, chronic disease care being a key case study in global perspective. Cutting-edge design can mean different things in different contexts. Most people living with diabetes today in the world need devices that are repairable, durable, and accessible. And as changing climates interact with clinical medicine, people reporting insulin spoilage issues are also saying there's a growing need for temperature-stable insulin. But for innovations like these to come into being, it's necessary to intentionally design with people's lived realities in mind. Another example came to prominence during the early days of COVID, when my own family was diagnosed in 2020. We were told, along with many other Americans, to get a pulse oximeter and to go to the hospital if blood oxygen levels reached 92. And as I sat watching this meter flicker between 91 and 92 and thinking about what these numbers meant, I saw how those numbers were being given real weight in hospital triage at the time. Yet I also knew there was historical scholarship about how light and color sensing technologies, such as Kodak film famously, had been designed and calibrated historically using mostly white test groups, which ended up creating inaccuracies for people with other skin tones. And one would imagine these issues of different light absorption across skin tones would be even more important when it comes to a device that works not just by reflectance, how light bounces off skin, as in the case of Kodak, but most oximeters today work by transmittance, how light LED shines through the skin to a probe on the other side of the finger. And just a reminder, so an oximeter is estimating blood oxygen saturations using light and color to assess basically iron-containing hemoglobin in the blood, which is a warmer red color when more fully saturated, cooler color when desaturated, is captured in cartoons like this. But that cartoon, like many current medical standards, is still missing the question of how different levels of melanin and other chromophores in skin and tissues might fit into such light measurements. So knowledge of these social histories of design contexts led me to ask, how had oximetry designers managed to overcome this? If they had, there was a lot other optical engineers could be learning from their success. And if those issues haven't yet been addressed, then the situation called for needed innovation ahead in order to make such devices accurate for everyone. Researching this social history together with colleagues at MIT CERC, we found that there had been studies like these decades ago. So as the ethnographer, I interviewed the doctors who did those studies, spoke with doctors in COVID clinics who by and large didn't think at the time that errors like these could matter in clinical management. But I also spoke with engineers at MIT, like Brian Anthony, who told me when I reached out that this issue hadn't been solved, though it should be solvable. And even though it went against medical consensus at the time, those conversations at CERC were enough to give us confidence to publish about the concern and say, here's an area of undone science and missing data. But we know implicit bias is already a key issue around many health inequities. So let's take that leap. And maybe some outside-the-box doctors somewhere will find this and look at their existing hospital data more closely with these questions in mind. And that was what happened. A few months later, the first doctors who looked at their clinical metadata found that oximeter device errors were 3 times more common for patients with darker skin tones when it came to discrepancies significant enough to impact the clinical management of care. And they actually found errors that put about 16% of Black patients in the category for no clinical treatment when they in fact did need treatment, for example. And this team of doctors reached out to let us know that when they were first seeing errors like these, when they first saw errors like these, so an arterial blood gas that was actually at 83, but the pulse oximeter was reading at 97. So at first they thought it was a COVID thing, but nothing made sense. And when the doctors found our essay about this kind of history, they reached out to thank us for putting anthropology and engineering in dialogue at MIT, because it helped them learn about studies in their own fields of specialty that they actually had never learned in medical school. So this started something of a movement among physicians who have since noted similar patterned errors in other optical tools, such as forehead thermometers, for example. And it raises that question, how are other algorithms impacted in turn? So here you can see one tiny piece of one algorithm, the Rothman index, where oxygen scores are put into 8 different bins. So through things like this, one can imagine that even minor errors might end up mattering in ways that are important for us to pay attention to. And other researchers have also pointed out we need to understand the impacts for other devices that are in turn being fed this data as part of direct inputs, such as AI-guided ventilators that may soon become more common. So we're used to thinking of vital signs as unmediated data. But now, as we grapple more seriously with these questions of how they're also processed signals, we need to be paying attention to things like what have AI models learned from historical data sets with disproportionate inaccuracies? What next steps are needed to make sure that AI can be part of solutions to these questions if used with care, but we need to be investing in these kinds of interdisciplinary conversations that could make that possible. So in SHAS, we've created classes like the Social Lives of Medical Objects for students to consider how ethnographically informed design practices might resonate in their own work. And to think about, in this age of personalized medicine, how to make sure that basic inputs like vital signs are the foundation for the rest of the work happening in accurate ways. Those are things we can work on and teach our students to pay attention to. And I'm so glad to be part of a team now working to build a health and society education pathway at MIT. And many people here are already doing this work in moments of serendipitous convergence. But we believe MIT HEALS has the opportunity to go further and create a sustained architecture to support training for rising experts capable of grappling with these social and ethical questions from the outset of their work in health. And to build skill sets to capacitate our students to more creatively maneuver through the realities at hand and identify potential openings and alignments in policy and social structures, to be equipped to more humanely shape this future that we're making together. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It's really a great honor and a fantastic opportunity for me to speak with you today. My name is Simon Johnson. It was up there a moment ago. And this is a joint project with Michael Minner, who's sitting in the audience here. And thank you, Joe, for the invitation to be here and for MIT HEALS for organizing this whole thing. And to meet Barry, Dimitri, and Amy, what fantastic and inspiring talks and presentations. And I think that's exactly what Michael and I are trying to build, is something that taps into precisely this amazing combination of technical, practical, deep social anthropological thinking to modestly redesign how we think about prevention and particularly how we think about public health. So the initiative that we're building, at least our name for it, and it's still underway, is the MIT Public Health and Resilience Lab, with the emphasis being on public health systems. Now, obviously, we have absolutely fantastic healthcare systems in this country and in some other parts of the world. And Barry is at the forefront of many of the things that have gone right with healthcare. But at the same time, I think you will have noticed over the past few years, and perhaps even in current debates, a certain amount of friction around public health, around what are we doing to maintain the health of everybody in good times, but also in particular emergency situations. And feel free to disagree and open debate, I think, is going to be my answer on the how do we build trust around any of this, Joe, when we get to that point. Our terminology or our words for this are that the institutions and incentives underlying public health are fragmented, they're fragile, and they're deeply underdeveloped in the United States in 2026. So we're attempting to change that. And we're trying to come at it from an institutional perspective to try and assess what exactly are the problems. Well, I think we know what the problems are: reactive funding, fragmented responsibility, and weak market incentives. But how do we change that? What is it that would realign in some deep way, in some meaningful way, incentives for innovative people and technologists to connect with people in the healthcare sector, to really make sure we listen to the customer, listen to people who have health issues, whether or not they've been already identified and treated within the healthcare system. That's what we're trying to come at. And both Michael and I had, I think, rather searing experiences during the pandemic, and I think many of you probably did too, where we understood and appreciated the depth of medical terminology that was available and that was helpful, so in terms of vaccines and in terms of diagnostic testing. But there were problems, right? There were problems with distribution and allocation of vaccines, or issues with that, questions with that. And there's also been subsequently a great deal of discourse about vaccines that we have to be open about and have to find ways to deal with. And in diagnostic testing, I think in retrospect, and Michael was very involved, for example, with the testing capabilities that were built at the Broad Institute. Thank you for that, Michael, helping to reopen MIT and other places. Some of the pieces fell into place relatively quickly. A lot of those pieces were very expensive. Cheap surveillance-type testing was available quite early in the pandemic, in retrospect, but it wasn't authorized, and it wasn't approved, and it wasn't rolled out. So why is it that we have been able to build such strong healthcare systems, and yet we are lagging in terms of providing a resilient system of public health that matters in good times? I'm sure it would address many of the issues that Amy's talking about, for example, with regard to diabetes, but also in health emergencies, and when the time, if we never have another pandemic, that's totally fine with me, but I think we will have health emergencies of various kinds. And I think what's interesting from a historical point of view, including from the perspective of MIT, is at the beginning of MIT and the beginning of modern organized engineering thought in the United States, healthcare was an important, public health was an important part of it. Building sewer systems was actually something that the first generations of civil engineers at MIT grappled with because it was a fundamental problem, reducing infectious disease, dealing with sewage. And that link between healthcare and engineering has obviously remained to some extent, but it's not, in our conception, driving enough of both the innovation process and the conversion of innovation into practical products, practical services that have value, that generate a return that gets reinvested in this process. So we want to build a stronger prevention economy in which individuals, employers, insurers, and industry invest in technologies and systems that reduce health risk before disease occurs. So this is going to be about early detection of technologies, sensing systems, population-scale health monitoring, as well as pandemic preparedness and various kinds of resilience tools. And I would emphasize that the importance of market incentives. I think that public health professionals should speak for themselves, but the idea of making money off public health has become, well, it's not a top priority item. And that's fine. If you can get consistent federal government funding for your initiatives without generating profit from these activities, great. But I think we're experiencing one episode of difficulty around that kind of funding because relying on the federal government is relying on a single point of failure in this space. So let's try and build things that have their own self-sufficiency, that makes enough money, that generate capital that can come back into those systems. And let's think about the prevention stack, and let's think about, including with people like Barry, where the prevention stack, and Dimitri, where the prevention stack is already strong, where your kind of innovation is taking care of the problem, in which case that's fantastic because that is a direct spillover or direct spillover effects to the public health system that can be captured. And let's think, Amy, with people like yourself, about where the gaps are and where the connections are not happening, either because the reimbursement isn't there or because certain sets of patients are being overlooked or for whatever other reason. And let's have an integrated MIT level approach. Okay, we're open to innovations from other places, let's be clear. We're very open-minded, but let's start with MIT, because it seems to us from our assessment of your work and the work of all our colleagues that there is already an incredible amount of knowledge and useful applications around every single one of these elements. I don't think there's an exception to that. So let's bring it all together, let's recognize those synergies, and let's create an integrated framework where we present to the world what these better solutions look like, what are reasonable rates of return on capital that's invested, what kind of innovations should be pursued, and when some of these are successful, let's take some of that money, I would say take as much as possible, and plow it back into financing MIT HEALS and other initiatives like this. I don't see why that isn't absolutely fundamentally achievable and something we should drive for over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that, I mean, speaking from the perspective of the Sloan School and our MBA students, including graduates of the EMBA program, I believe that's Barry, I think that the amount of interest in this is already enormous and will be absolutely off the charts. Because you're trying to solve really difficult social problems by bringing private sector initiative, tapping into the strongest technological development capacity anywhere in the world and making it work for people and not missing anyone, Amy. And I do think it's very important that it's not about the money, it's not about the prestige, it's about reaching people where they are, and it's about talking to them, it's about understanding. I thought the slide you put up about with the diabetes strips was utterly compelling, right? Meet people really where they are and help them believe in what you're offering in terms of improved technology and improved systems, and have them tell their political representatives why it's so important. That's the way to do it. I think top-down, us telling people this is better, fine if they'll believe you, but much better to have people reach out and be convinced and try to convince their political representatives. So I think of this lab as a form of incubator, but not a standard relatively narrow, focused commercial incubator. It's a very big, broad policy incubator, policy and social incubator, where we're going to be talking about policy, talking about institutional design, bringing more entrepreneurship to bear, and developing talent and also educating people across any part of this space in what we think works, what we can show works, but also getting feedback, also having lots of arguments, having things out in the open and be directly confronted as opposed to saying, be quiet, we've got PhDs and you don't. That's not what we're about here. I don't think it's what any of you are about either. And we do think, or this is Michael's term, and I want to give him full credit for this, that there is a space that can and should be developed, and we think MIT is the perfect place for it, called public health engineering, which is in some ways a throwback to the early days of civil engineering at MIT, but it's also something different. It's something that we don't actually have, not fully developed in the United States or in the world currently, and it is bringing together precisely all the varied strengths of MIT, attempting to build a more resilient population. I'm Simon Johnson. I work at the Sloan School. I've been here for 40 years. I came here when I was 10 to get my PhD. And Michael Minna, who's sitting at the back. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, so I've been so much enjoying the whole conversation from the beginning till now. And a common theme that's been running through all of your talks is about trust, whether Amy and Barry were talking about patients trusting data privacy, or Dimitri, you were talking about the providers trusting what comes out of that algorithm, and of course public trust is essential for public health. So the question I have for the panel here is, given that that's a prerequisite building this trust, what steps do you think we should take as academics or industry leaders to help ensure and rebuild that kind of trust? Maybe I'll start with Barry.
I think I mentioned trust is everything in healthcare, and every step of the way we have to consider what we're bringing in and how it'll impact trust. There are ways we can mitigate rupture of trust, the first of which is making sure that our patients have the knowledge of the AI or the innovation that's disrupting everything around them. Knowledge is power, education is power. Similarly for our clinicians, it's very important for our patients to trust that our clinicians or their physicians have the knowledge to use this powerful technology safely to their benefit. The second of which is to demonstrate accountability. There has to be accountability all the way through, if things go right and if things go wrong. And the third piece is transparency. Really making sure that whatever we're doing, everybody's aware. With trust really being at the forefront every single time. And just, the last piece I would say is that sometimes I'm asked, what do I hope AI can do for healthcare? Or what do I hope AI will replace in healthcare? And I really like to say the following. I hope AI replaces everything in healthcare that gets in the way of a clinician-patient relationship and the patient and the physician trusting one another.
First of all, trust is not only relevant in healthcare, it's relevant in life. I don't work with people I don't trust, and I think it's the same on the other way. So I'll share one example to demonstrate what I have learned. I work with many physicians at Hartford Healthcare. I started working on a cardiac surgery that involved 6 physicians. The senior physician, I have worked with him in a common friend of ours, Bob Handberg, was already reasonably trusting that we know what we are doing. The other people, of course, were involved, but we have not gained their trust. It was very obvious. But we start meeting. We meet once every 2 weeks for about half an hour to an hour. And because they start becoming part of the story and owners of the ideas, when we finish something, and the time has come to present, they present it. They didn't want me to present it to their colleagues. So I have observed a trusting relation building over over a period of time because of the feeling of, as Barry mentioned, it takes quite a bit of time to build it. You can lose it overnight, but in my opinion, the key aspect of somewhat success that we have had in Hartford Healthcare is because of the trust with the physicians, the nurses, the students, and the faculty involved.
So it's that human connection that you have to build over time.
Yeah. And without it, I don't see success.
How about you, Amy?
Yeah, a lot of the patients and families that I work with, and even many of our students here at MIT, I hear talk about feeling caught in this framing of the problem as patients versus profits and all the, predictable and often real tensions around those issues. And I really think getting outside those tensions as a false binary is important. And Simon, what you were saying about trying to get incentives in the right place to protect people over time and to bring into being the worlds people want to see. The social knowledge is there, people are speaking, and when there isn't kind of a channel to recognize those viewpoints and bring them into our systems, then they erupt into refusal altogether, or ripple effects of trust even beyond any one specific project or policy. And so I think paying attention to the little things as they come up really matters, and this work to get incentives, aligned with patient concerns. I see a lot of value there.
Podcasts, Joe, podcasts. So I have a podcast with Gary Gensler, who's the former chair of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission and former chair of the Securities Exchange Commission, about economics. And the point of the podcast is you have to talk about things in an open way, in a transparent way, in a way that people can relate. Actually, we bring a lot of material from our class, Gary and I do. It's called Power and Consequences. You can subscribe. But we'll do another podcast on these issues and on the course that Michael Miller and I are going to build at Sloan. And hopefully we'll invite Amy and Barry and Dimitri to be part of that too. And we'll talk about these issues in an open and transparent way. Put everything out there, explain to people, not saying that anybody here is doing that, but it's not about talking down to people, it's about engaging them in the conversation. And it's about meeting them, honestly, in social media where they are today, which is in some good places and some bad places, right? So I think shortening the distance between conversations we have at MIT, between very well-informed and thoughtful people, and the conversations that are happening socially, we want to lower that distance and get more MIT into that social discourse.
All right, so we've been hearing about these innovations all day and also some challenges, like Amy brought up, with health equity issues. And is there a particular, if you had to prioritize, what would be a binding constraint on whether it's our policies or whether it's the labor market, whether it's the healthcare market, policies around that? What is a binding constraint that the sort of industry leaders and political leaders here can start to grapple with? Maybe Simon, you can.
Yeah, I think it's related, Joe, to the previous question. It's about understanding. What do people believe they need? What do they think about in terms of their health and the health of the communities around them? What's the vision that everybody has for the health of their family, their friends, the social circle, or the broader society? And I think that's the friction.
The common ground is.
Yeah, but I think that there's a lot of, the reason there's a lot of misinformation, maybe some disinformation, is because people's understanding is tenuous. And we can fill these gaps together and separately and jointly. I think we have a tremendous amount to bring to that. And people are super interested. And they want to listen. They want to be engaged. But without that understanding, without that vision, it's very hard to make any progress at all in the political sphere.
How about you, Amy? Is there a particular binding constraint you'd want us to try to tackle here at MIT?
Well, I think the last panel had so many interesting and inspiring examples of citizen science being recognized and brought into the fold of how problems are being defined and addressed. And I think ethnography and social sciences can also be a tool for making sure that work doesn't fall on patients and families alone, but bringing those social priorities kind of into how we're scoping the questions we're asking and the research we're doing. I see a lot of potential there.
Not surprisingly, I have been an educator all my life. I think the binding constraint is, if we're going to incorporate AI technologies in the medical profession, is education, which is, in my view, significantly missing from the clinicians, from the nurses that I interact. Maybe you guys interact with other people, but this is my human experience. And I believe that we here at MIT have a responsibility and an opportunity to educate the world in ways of how the new technologies can be developed, applied ethically, responsibly, and also building trust. The reason I think, again, I speak from experience. During COVID, I've given a series of lectures, exactly the very beginning of COVID, and then later or afterwards, to many people at Harvard Healthcare, about 300 people, and then 300 after that. It really led, not that they understand in detail what AI is, but the art of the feasible was established, and perhaps a bit of trust. So I have seen the effects. We work with 100 physicians who, while they don't understand the details of AI, they have some belief that, and some understanding that this might be a force for the good. So this is a call to arms to my friends at Hills.
Can you say something about the open learning and where that might fit in?
Yeah, open learning is an environment that has about roughly 200 people. It has a very strong history. Currently, we have been working what we call universal learning for the world. We have launched AI, universal AI. We have climate and energy, but healthcare is coming. So not only AI and health. I would say, while Hills is primarily a research environment, I would say the combination of open learning and Hills could raise the bar to be able to educate the world in ways that educate the world of health, in ways that I would say they will be impactful for the world. And I do believe this is a binding constraint.
Simon,
yeah, if I could just reinforce or double underline what Dimitri's saying. I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and I think the brand of MIT, which has been very carefully managed over a long period of time, is extremely good across the aisle, because people look to MIT for expertise and to understand what is the technology and what is not the technology. So I think that degree of honesty, and I think Dimitri's efforts to open this up and to reduce the gap between people who have the knowledge and people who are interested and care and think about what the country should invest in, I think it's absolutely fantastic and really an admirable priority. Thank you, Dimitri, for doing that.
On April 8th, it's the 25th year anniversary of open coursework. I can say this because I have nothing to do with this. But it has been a remarkable home run accomplishment for the MIT community to develop. I have 3 of my PhD students today that wouldn't be at MIT if it wasn't for CW. They come from far and away countries. I would say this is an opportunity for the Institute, and obviously I will use the opportunity to, I have the floor for 5 minutes, to actually say something about health and other areas, climate, central problems of the world. But that's a significant opportunity for us. That's my belief anyway.
Great. And Barry, you see the bottlenecks, and we have all these innovations coming down the pike. From your standpoint, from a provider standpoint, what is stopping us from joining the latest and greatest? The diffusion of the best technologies is too slow. What are the issues?
Yeah, I want to sort of underscore what Simon said. It's the gap. It's the gap. It's the gap. It's the knowledge gap. It's the trust gap. It's the gap. And I love how you are doing your podcast to normalize the conversation, to close the gap, because the quicker we can normalize the AI topic, the more trust there'll be and the more acceptance of AI there'll be. But the biggest constraint, I believe, or second to trust, is we talk about innovation is equal to an idea times execution or implementation. And implementation of AI into healthcare is extraordinarily difficult. Extraordinarily difficult for multiple reasons, some of which I mentioned in the few words that I had. But a lot of it is related to infrastructure. Many places don't have the infrastructure to be able to implement this at scale. The second of which is protecting our patients' data. And thirdly, if you're not intimately aware and attuned to the clinician's workflow, you can make a huge, huge mess and put everything at risk. So implementation and execution science, to me, is the biggest binding constraint to enjoying all the potential we can think about.
Well, borrowing from Simon's podcast, I hope you all like and subscribe. Our mission here at HEALS to innovate for impact. So thanks so much.